Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Music Buds podcast. This is episode number 60, and my name is Henry. This week, I'm so happy to be joined by composer Keegan DeWitt, known for a huge number of acclaimed projects, including All the Bright Places, Her Smell, A Teacher. It just goes kind of on and on. Keegan, thank you so much for taking the time. I really do appreciate it, and I am a fan of your work.
Awesome, man. Thank you for thinking of me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, how's life for you these days?
It's good. It's like I feel like the nature of composing, especially now, just with the landscape of how stuff is that you're always balancing two or three things and figuring out how to not go crazy.
Yeah, for sure. Well, how did you end up getting started in music? Like, what was that process like?
I had played music, like growing up, I played in punk bands and stuff, and I was always kind of musical in that way. Weirdly, it was never what I aimed to do with my career. I went to like a school where I studied like stage and screenwriting, and then I went to a film conservatory for college. And it just so happened that like my best friend growing up had a film. He was also in film school. And he had a film that got in to South by Southwest, and he knew that I made music and reached out to me and he was like, "Hey, do you want to do the score for my film?" And I was like, I mean, I guess I don't know what I'm doing, but sure. And so I sort of stumbled into it, and it's been like a great ride because I feel like one of the things it's always like what your insecurities are usually what makes you kind of unique and interesting in what you do. And I've tried to lean into the fact that, I didn't go to Berkeley for film composing, so, I went to school to be a storyteller. So I try and take that as something that is, one of my strengths into composing is that I'm kind of a filmmaker first and a composer by accident. And more in terms of just not being precious about certain things and really making sure that I'm putting the story first and the filmmaking first.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing, although, I mean, there are a ton of different projects to talk about. One of my favorites is Her Smell, the Elizabeth Moss, which is about this punk rock star who kind of has this decline and then a kind of a rebirth, so to speak. And I saw it a few years ago. It's just completely just crazy movie, but it's really good. And the one thing I was looking at is that some of the tracks, because it's, a 5-act structure, is like the tracks are like 20 minutes long.
Yeah.
So I was curious, like, was that the process from the beginning? Was that like the director saying that's what he wanted, or did you stumble upon that yourself?
Well, we knew that we wanted it to feel like a panic attack. That was kind of like our outline on it. And so, I gave him a bunch of maybe like 6-minute things, but the thought was always that they were going to get threaded together. The editor on all of Alex's stuff is this great filmmaker in his own right, Robert Greene. And me and Robert have like a really unique relationship in that I send him a bunch of stuff like stems and stereo mixes and everything. And he really Frankensteins stuff together. And so he'll cut shit up and pitch it up and down and take a stem and repeat a part. And I mean, there was even in that where he was like, he sent it to me and he's like, "All right, this is a total mess. You try and make sense of it." And I listened back to it and I was like, "This is perfect. I wouldn't touch this," And there was also moments where he was like, "So I added this sound of like a dog barking, but then I pitched it down an octave in this section." It's like he was adding crazy stuff in there, but in a good way where, that film in general, I think was divisive, or it's like to me that film and hopefully that score, it's almost barely a score, but what we did with that film hopefully will be something that 20 years from now, like some film nerd will come back to and really appreciate. I think that like it came like right before COVID and right in this weird kind of transition thing, and it had a weird premiere and stuff. So I hope that eventually it sort of gets the love that it deserves, because it is really wild.
Yeah. And because I feel like, keeping like, a 20-minute track, I guess, interesting, so to speak, would be like a tough thing. But I guess since the movie is, again, it is these very distinctive acts, it's like a continuous, there's not really a break with the character. So it makes sense that you wouldn't want the music to end either.
Yeah. And the whole thing is about just being this like low level panic attack, that it's just constantly chugging beneath what's happening, so that even if Lizzie leaves the room, you're like, oh my God, is she about to come back? And you never let the rope go lack,
Yeah. And is it like with a story like that or a character like that, where it is this like a mental breakdown, is that something that feeds into your mind as you're doing it? Or is it just kind of, that's the story and I'm making the music for it? Or does that kind of dark atmosphere kind of hit you as well while you're doing it?
I mean, I feel like at that point, I can't remember if it was the third film I'd scored with Lizzie in the lead. And so I mean, for me, I'm really tied to actors and performance, just in terms of what sort of informs the raw feeling of stuff. And so I kind of knew the end. As soon as I read it, Alex had written it for her and I had worked, scoring for her multiple times. So I kind of knew what her energy was going to be, and I just started like collecting sounds, whether it was like with the modular setup or the, analog drums or whatever it was. And I just kind of got into Ableton and went crazy,
Yeah. It was because you also did Queen of Earth with her. Was that because obviously it's not 20-minute tracks, but was like the process similar, or was it wholly different?
Well, it is similar. When I get like hired onto a very formal studio movie, there's a process, where they like tempt with music and then they lock music and then we talk about it and spot it and I'm scoring, or I'm writing like a suite that has like, 4 different themes sort of baked into it and stuff, where the stuff with Alex and that Robert's editing and Robert's films is, and I'm sort of convinced that this is how you come up with a unique score in general, is you don't score to picture, like I read the script and get excited and then they're shooting and maybe I'm on set 1 or 2 days and get inspired. And then I just create essentially a toolbox of music for the editor, Yeah. And so that was like, for example, there's like a 6.5-minute scene in Queen of Earth where they're sitting in this bedroom talking and it's just this meandering clarinet, essentially is like a clarinet stem. Like I created, this, a piece and then gave Robert some stuff. And a part of that, of a larger piece, was this clarinet stem that was maybe 2 minutes long. And he's just like looping it, or like taking sections of it and putting it around. And it creates this like really beautiful thing where I'm sure that, on a different, more formal film, we would have sat down, we would have spotted it, and it would have been like, well, it needs to change here and it needs to do this thing. And when she and by just kind of giving stuff over to Robert, it created this world where we could just surprise ourselves with music, And I think it's like that process, allows us to come up with music that people are like, "Ooh, this is interesting. I don't hear this every day." And it's because we're not scoring strictly to picture,
Yeah. And what about like a project like the Hulu miniseries, A Teacher, which was this, a kind of controversial story about this, teacher getting involved with the student. Is that, doing like a miniseries and or a controversial subject? What's, I guess, is there any different kind of process mentally of you getting into that, or is it just, again, is it the project? I'm gonna score it as it needs to be done, or does that the outer exterior parts kind of feed into how you go about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, that was one where I knew that Kate Morrow was going to be in it, and I knew Nick Robinson. It's like I feed into their sort of who they are as actors, but also it's more that it sets rules and boundaries, because it means that we can't lean into romance too much. You can't lean into like glorifying either of these people. And it's a similar constraint, honestly, to scoring comedy, which is like, it's really hard to score comedy and do it well because you don't want to be too cheeky and lean into jokes too. It's like you have to hit this weird, intangible sort of middle lane where you're like propelling the story and telling things and highlighting emotions and giving things emotional depth, but not doing it in a way where you're endorsing anything, if that makes any sense. Like, it's just really hard because there's moments in that series that need to feel sexy or need to feel emotional or need to feel romantic, but they have to do it with this almost ambivalence where it's kind of happening, but we're not leaning in and endorsing any one thing. So it's just Yeah, a lot of my job is, no matter what the project is figuring out how to do something in a way that's not too on the nose, but I mean, that can even apply to like all the bright places, it's like,
Yeah.
I feel like that movie, if it hadn't been done by Brett and we hadn't had this long lasting friendship going into it, then it would have been temped with a bunch of teen music and had like a lot of electric guitars and drums and then like had a couple sappy like piano cues, but it would have never been able to have this sort of like chamber orchestral score that it has, which I feel like helps elevate it beyond just being like a YA movie that somebody might elevator pitch you of like, oh, it's YA, you get it. And I think that the thing that makes that film special is that the score and how Brett used the score takes it to a place that feels more unique.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I did really notice right away about your music is, like there'll be one project like, like All the Bright Places, which is more, not in any lesser effect, but it's a more traditional kind of style. And then you have like Her Smell or The Last Thing Mary Saw, where it's basically like this rumbling, like a heartbeat. I feel like that would be kind of a fun, and I guess that's maybe personal choice, or maybe it's, things you get offered as well. But I feel like having that variety and diversity in your music would be very interesting, because you could go from really happy, fun teen drama to like mental breakdown, decline, insanity.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's for me, that's like the greatest aspect of my job, is that I get to really like on each project totally morph into whatever, I'm still bringing myself to it, but like you said, getting to like just go down a different hallway, you know what I mean? And experiment with all these different things. I mean, it's funny because like I enjoy versatility. It's easier to get work when you do the same kind of sounding score every time, and I think that's something that has maybe made my path as a film composer professionally slightly more difficult, is that because I can do a lot of stuff and continue to kind of try and seek out things to do different sounding scores, that, people don't instantly just go like, oh, you do this type of score, I'm going to hire you for that, but it's funny because like you said, like I operate in such wildly different worlds that like I think that on a studio level, like there's probably people who have the idea of me being like, oh yeah, he does like YA stuff and romantic comedies and like Divorce for HBO, and then like people who know me from like indie world are like, oh, he does like Her Smell, or he does, like these crazier things too. So I feel like it's like I have two different existence depending on who's hiring me, if that makes sense,
Yeah, for sure. And are there any, I mean, and maybe it's something like Her Smell, but are there any projects in particular that you look back on that were like, that was just crazy in terms of the challenge, or that was like something I wish I could do that all over again? Are there any standout moments that you think back on in particular?
I mean, All the Bright Places for me is probably my thing that I'm most proud of, mainly because it's just like, because it's so rare how it unfolded, which is like, I sat down and over like 2 days wrote the entire 11-minute suite. And then I orchestrated it all and handed it off to Brett. And Brett is a very like specific, very picky, very like he has a taste that he, you know what I mean? Like he's not just somebody who's like, oh, I don't really know music. Like he is very specific about his music, And I sent him this 11-minute long. That's how they started, was essentially like the entire score was this 11-minute long flowing thing, which I think if you listen to it now on Spotify or whatever, it's the first 3 tracks basically, but they were one long thing. And thank God, like he called me and was like, I didn't know what to think for like a minute. And then I was like, I love this, which was great. So then that was a huge gift as well. And then as we were laying it in, it was the kind of thing where like every scene that we'd lay it in, we were just like, holy shit, this is awesome. It feels great. Like doing all the things we needed to do, rather than like sometimes I'll write a whole bunch of music and I'll think it sounds great. And then we'll go to temp it into the movie. And it's like, this is not our movie. Like this is cool music, but like, it's not the movie, Mm-hmm. So it was like great. It was like amazing in that the writing process was really like magical and quick. The approval process was really magic and quick. And then temping it in, every time we temped it in, we were like, oh my God, this feels great, Yeah. So, and then also for me, just because of so much of what I do is dictated by the projects that I get and the directors and the collaborators I get. And it just hadn't happened that I had done like a really big string section like that. So it felt really nice to finally do that, because it was like being able to say like, oh, I'm not just doing indie scores. Like this is, we're recording this in Capitol Studios and downtown Hollywood, and like we've got the full orchestra and stuff. And that felt good to finally listen back to it or see it in the theater and be like, yeah, this is great.
Yeah. So you've had a lot of projects that you've been involved with go to Sundance, and one just kind of sidebar is I saw the movie The Hero, the Sam Elliott movie, when I was at Sundance that year.
Oh, cool.
So yeah. Really enjoyed that one. Well, I guess, what do you typically like when you're starting up? What do you typically draw from, like, in terms of, are you thinking of like music you listened to when you were a kid, like, or like, just, are you just purely drawing from the emotion of things? Like, is there something that you maybe, or if you ever get a brain fog, something you that helps spark your imagination a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, good habits is one, like trying to just sit down at the piano every day with my voice memos and grab stuff, that helps. Because that way I know, like, okay, cool, I've got a folder of ideas. I know there's some good stuff in there, that helps. But, I still pull from a lot of, like, I think a lot of people are like this, like you have the certain influences that really shaped you early on and got you excited. And you always are kind of revisiting those. A lot of those for me are like Michael Nyman is a composer I really admire, and Ryuichi Sakamoto is another. And so for me, they're both very melody forward composers, And so so much of modern score is like tonal right now. It's all about like just tones, and unless you're talking like, Michael Giacchino or something like that. But like for me, I feel like something that I can bring is melody. And so I often start by sitting down at the piano and just sketching things on the piano, and then extrapolating that into the orchestra or synths or whatever else it would be. But often, like, I think that that's another reason why All the Bright Places for me felt really satisfying, is because it is so melodic, and it's not like this tonal underscore. It's like very much something that leads with melody. So I try to always start there at the piano, pretty much.
Yeah. And is there anything, I guess, talking about the big picture, like when you just started out composing kind of out of the blue, is there anything that you kind of realized over time that you didn't think you'd be doing as much, or something that maybe a lot of people don't realize about composing? Is there anything any weird lessons you've learned over the years, anything like that?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, mixing. I mean, I'm constantly having to mix and get better at mixing and learn. I mean, like when I was in bands, I didn't even think about it. Like we'd go into a studio and someone would engineer and record us and do a basic mix, but it's like my job is like, feels like it's like 40% composing, 60% mixing. I'm constantly having to figure out how to make things sound good. And it's like, I'm producing alongside composing, like I can't just pull out, even though I have plenty of expensive, synths or sample libraries. Even the most expensive sample library, if I pull it out, it's not going to sound realistic unless I know how to A, program it, but B, mix it and get it to sound good. And even if we're going to record real strings eventually, I can't give the studio something that sounds like butt. You know what I mean? It's got to sound great and feel really compelling. So that's something that like for example, like during COVID, when stuff sort of shut down and everything was on pause for a while, I would just like spend those days getting better at mixing, like literally like watching Chad Blake videos on Mix with the Masters and shit, like just being like, how do I get better at doing this, And that's true of arranging too, but my brain is, I'm like not, I'm very like, I need to be tactile in doing it. So that's why I often like team with an arranger and work alongside an arranger, because I feel like it helps me not only speed up that process, but get more unique arrangements. Like I feel like if I were to have done all the Bright Places by myself in terms of arrangement, it wouldn't be as interesting as it is because I collaborate with my arranger, Dabney.
Yeah. Well, a couple other kind of just quick things, like in terms of the variety. So like another project like Gemini, which has that, it's almost like a nightclub feel, which is really cool. And then also there's the documentary Bombshell about Hedy Lamarr. Is that like doing like a documentary any different from anything else? Is your mindset different?
Yeah, I don't really do docs anymore, mainly just because it's a lot of music, it's a lot of work, and they last forever, because they're always like, something new happened. Now we're going to like reopen it and, come up with a new part. And I feel like it's really hard to do cinematic music for documentaries. This is not an indictment of documentary makers by any means, but I think that there's like a lot of people who are like, oh, I've got a lot of talking heads in my movie and I feel insecure about the tempo. So I'm going to put a lot of chuggy, digga, 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 digga music underneath it. It's just like, I'm sure as everyone's realized, like there's not a lot of unique sounding documentary scores. And so now the only times that I'll really do a documentary score is when they'll let me essentially approach it like I approach stuff with Robert and his documentaries, where I send him a bunch of cool, interesting cinematic music and then he kind of tempts it in. And, I did another documentary called Human Nature that was similar to that, where it was like, instead of just being a bunch of boring kind of processy doc music, we scored it like it's a narrative film, and that I think that's an interesting challenge. But yeah, I try to avoid documentaries just because it is wall to wall music, and by the nature of how they're constructed, they need a lot of music to just make you feel like things are happening. So it's just a different task too, There's a lot of people who are really good at documentaries, so I'm sort of like, unless they want unless the brief is we want this to be scored like it's a narrative, then I'm probably not the person for it.
Right. And with having done all these different kinds of projects, are there any genres, any styles, subject matters, anything that you'd like to do that you haven't done yet, that if you could choose, hey, I'd love to do this kind of movie? Or
yeah, I mean, I would love to do more thriller and action stuff. It's like a lot of my stuff is more emotional or romantic or comedy or whatever. And I would, doing like, I got to do a little bit of it in Little Fish and a little bit in Gemini, but I would love to be able to do essentially what I did with All the Bright Places, in terms of that being like this beautiful chamber orchestra kind of modern classical thing. But if I could do that as a thriller, that would be really fun. The full orchestra kind of action stuff would be really cool. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, of course, there's a million things we could talk about, but one thing I always do like to ask is just out of curiosity for people, if you had a desert island artist, doesn't have to be a composer, could be rock band, singer, who would you take if you could only have one music artist to desert island?
Oh man, that's really hard. Yeah. I mean, for me, things like I would just say that I always go back to is the Michael Nyman record, The Piano Sings, and Ryuichi Sakamoto's playing the piano, where it's basically them performing their compositions, but just on solo piano. And it's great. And that's essentially what got me excited about making movies in the first place.
Yeah. And do you like to watch, like in your off time, do you like to watch movies, TV shows a lot, or are you typically so busy you just, you're already so consumed by that stuff that you don't?
I mean, for the longest time, I avoided buying any records because I just realized it was a total succubus of finances, but during right before COVID, basically, I started to realize that I wasn't recreationally listening to music, or if I was listening to the same like 5 artists who were top of mind. Cause I'm just like, between having 2 kids and listening to music all day long that I'm making, I just like get in the car and be like, oh yeah, sure. That playlist I was listening to, So I've tried to really lean into buying a lot more records lately so that I can have that kind of library of music to pull from, which I feel like my generation, like I grew up, this is dating me, but like where you like have a fucking iTunes, you know what I mean? You're like, I downloaded this and I downloaded that, and you have this collection of music, and not having that in the streaming world really left a hole for me. Just, so I've tried to build that back now in the world of vinyl. And in terms of movies, I mean, it's A, my job, but B, it's like what got me into all of this in general is I love watching movies. So I still aggressively go and try and see as much stuff in the theater as I can. But due to the fact that I have kids, I spend a lot more time waiting for things to stream, or, it's like I always would joke because every time I would go to Sundance, I was the only one who would see movies. And it was because I was like, this is my chance to see a bunch of these movies.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's going to be 2 years before I can see them because I have to wait for them to hit VOD.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring up, like in terms of like recent projects that you're happy it's out, or anything else coming up that you're excited about? Anything else like that, or?
Yeah, I have a movie coming out in February called "It's All Coming Back to Me," directed by Jim Strauss, who I did Incredible Jessica James with, and I don't know. Besides that, no.
That's about it. Yeah. Well, Keegan, I mean, again, thank you so much for taking the time. All these projects that we've talked about, I have really enjoyed, and I really enjoy your music. So I really do appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And, but yeah, I hope to get you on again sometime, down the road, and, hopefully we can talk again. Okay.
Yeah. I'm here whenever.
All right. See you.
Right. See you, man.